As dawn broke on November 17, 1965, an eerie calm descended upon the Central Highlands, a deceptive stillness that belied the storm that was about to erupt. Having weathered the unrestrained battle at LZ X-ray, the soldiers of the 1st Cavalry Division, Airmobile, believed the worst was behind them. Amidst the rustling leaves and the distant calls of exotic birds, a column of soldiers were patrolling the forest. Their steps, though cautious, carried an air of carelessness, a sense of relaxation after the horrors they had just experienced. However, with every step taken, they unknowingly inched closer to an unseen ambush. The seemingly tranquil jungle was, in reality, a labyrinth of shadows and silent enemies ready to spring their deadly trap. The North Vietnamese forces, undeterred by heavy losses at LZ X-ray, were prepared to strike once more. Their target, landing Zone Albany. And so, in the dense jungles of the Drang Valley, another chapter of the gruesome battle is about to be written, darker, grimmer, and bloodier than what had gone before. The column that departed X-ray on the morning of 17th of November comprised Colonel Tully's 2nd Battalion of the 5th Cavalry, together with Colonel McDade's 2nd Battalion of the 7th Cavalry. Tully's battalion led the way, setting their course northeast towards landing zone Columbus. Meanwhile, McDade's battalion, accompanied by Captain George G. Forrest's Alpha Company, 1st Battalion of the 5th Cavalry, moved towards their destination, landing zone Albany. By 1100, after covering around 3 kilometers, Tully's battalion detached, proceeding east to Columbus, where a warm meal awaited them. McDade's forces, however, continued northwest, Albany being still 2 kilometers distant. Despite Tully's offer of protective marching fire, McDade declined, wary of revealing his battalion's position. Inexperience marred the march to Albany. Colonel McDade, relatively new in command, delegated tactical decisions to his officers. Some, like the commanders of Companies Charlie and Delta, became complacent during the journey, their units eventually dropping tactical formations. Captain Thorpe of Delta Company described the march as a mere walk in the sun. With such laxity, especially in an enemy-dominated terrain, men were calling for trouble. By midday, as the leading Alpha Company neared LZ Albany, an unexpected incident slowed their progress. The reconnaissance platoon from Delta Company, led by 2nd Lieutenant David Payne, captured 2 North Vietnamese deserters. Even though the interrogation yielded no strategic insights, the brief pause allowed many of McDade's exhausted men to rest, with some even drifting to sleep. Once the interrogation concluded, the battalion resumed its movement toward Albany. It was 1307 when Payne's reconnaissance platoon, along with segments of Captain Sugdennis's Alpha Company, had arrived at Albany. They swiftly established positions to secure the area for the battalion's remaining forces. LZ Albany had an irregular square, a central grove, and a nearby clearing suitable for helicopters. However, before fully occupying the LZ, Colonel McDade gathered his company commanders for a briefing on positioning their troops within the landing zone. Captains Forrest, Thorpe, and Fesmeyer heeded the call. Amidst this, Captain Forrest, alarmed by the relaxed demeanor of the troops he passed, ordered heightened vigilance. The apparent casualness of their approach to the LZ hinted at a dangerous underestimation of the potential threats lurking nearby. It was as if he foreboded the terror that was about to befall them. Post the X-ray clash, the North Vietnamese, despite heavy losses, remained undeterred in their resolve to challenge the 1st Cavalry Division. General Mann, with his available B-3 front units, was determined to engage them again. He had the 66th Regiment's 8th Battalion, a company from the 33rd Regiment's 1st Battalion, and the 33rd's 3rd Battalion's headquarters unit ready for combat. On the morning of November 17th, he directed the 8th Battalion to regroup and prepare for a potential large-scale encounter. By midday, based on crucial intelligence of the Americans' imminent approach, Colonel Ahn commanded the 8th Battalion to initiate an attack. Battalion Commander Le Chon Foy promptly set up an L-shaped ambush near the clearing, which seemed to be the Americans' target. The soldiers already in place formed the vertical arm of the L, while the 1st Battalion's company formed the base. This strategic positioning ensured the ambush would be directly in the path of McDade's approaching column. To reinforce the ambush's potency, Foy enlisted the aid of auxiliary staff, including cooks, clerks, and even porters. The North Vietnamese were meticulously prepared, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. The ambush was a masterstroke in its simplicity and ruthlessness. Waiting until the vanguard of McDade's force was almost within touching distance, the Vietnamese sprung their trap at 13:15. Initial gunfire seemed disjointed, mimicking the shots of a few random skirmishers. But in mere moments, a deafening barrage ensued, echoing the attackers' synchronized onslaught. At the moment the ambush unfolded, Captains Forrest, Thorpe, and Fesmeyer were meeting with Colonel McDade. While Fesmeyer and Thorpe remained with McDade amidst the commotion, Captain Forrest, sensing the urgency, dashed back to his unit. Tragically, his accompanying radio operators fell victim to enemy bullets, yet Forrest miraculously emerged unharmed. The central part of the American column, which was most vulnerable and unprepared, now found itself leaderless and scrambling for direction. The entire ambush was a picture of utter chaos for the Americans. From the Vietnamese end, the execution was seamless. Following the initial gunfire, Foy's mortars punctuated the assault, quickly followed by a fierce charge by his 8th Battalion soldiers. Many American soldiers were confounded, with some units like a platoon from Sug Dinnis's Alpha Company believing they were entirely lost. The ambush's success was epitomized by Sug Dinnis's grim assessment that his men had been annihilated or incapacitated. The center of McDade's column was in pandemonium. With the high grass obscuring vision, organized resistance rapidly collapsed. The intense proximity of the combat made the entire situation chaotic, with platoons and companies disintegrating, and individual soldiers desperately fending for themselves amidst the chaos. Battle formations dissolved, and the battleground became a frantic skirmish of individual soldiers fighting for survival. From his vantage point in the landing zone, Captain Fesmeyer recognized the dire situation facing Thorpe's Delta Company. Ordering Lieutenant Cornett's Charlie Company to come to their aid, attempts to stabilize the situation by both companies Delta and Charlie were thwarted by intense enemy fire, internal disorientation, and even tragic friendly fire incidents. The initial overwhelming success of the ambush left many American soldiers disoriented and trapped. As Colonel Brown and Captain Tadamy tried to survey the situation from the air, the sheer scale of the chaos on the ground became evident. The disarray was so profound that they couldn't accurately discern the positions of McDade's beleaguered troops, making precise aerial and artillery support nearly impossible. The desperation was palpable, and the situation looked increasingly bleak. The battle's intensity persisted as the day waned, with relentless airstrikes and artillery fire failing to decisively break the North Vietnamese grip in the column's middle. Desperate to safeguard the surviving perimeters, commanders resorted to blanketing the entire area with artillery, risking hitting their own men. As darkness settled, the brutal reality became clear. Isolated American soldiers, many injured or trapped, had to fend for themselves. Some had managed to form a makeshift defensive ring, while others, lost or incapacitated, awaited uncertain fates. To make the situation even more tragic, the North Vietnamese were executing stranded American soldiers in great numbers. In such harrowing conditions, hope emerged at dawn with the sound of familiar gunfire, indicating the arrival of friendly reinforcements. Yet, for many soldiers, the ordeal had taken its toll, both physically and mentally. Amidst the chaos created by the ambush, Alpha Company bore the brunt of the North Vietnamese assault, quickly losing their platoons to the encircling enemy. Outnumbered and outflanked, American forces displayed resilience. Despite the adversity, Payne's elite reconnaissance platoon held their ground at a strategic termite hill, while Sugdinis and his team fortified a neighboring hill. Colonel McDade's group fortified yet another. Their goal was to form a defensible triangle and create a central rallying point for the scattered troops. In a short span, Sugdinis and Lieutenant Gwyn consolidated a defense perimeter from the surviving soldiers, though it remained unsuitable for helicopter landings. Observing the North Vietnamese audaciously moving about, the Americans took the opportunity to eliminate dozens, realizing that the enemy was ruthlessly hunting their wounded comrades. This realization fueled their determination to keep fighting. As the combat continued, the paramount need for fire support grew evident. With Major Henry and Captain Fesmire's appeal, the A-1E Sky Raiders roared in from Pleiku. Despite the risk to potentially still-alive 2nd Platoon members, the commanders reluctantly agreed that the area outside the established defense perimeter was a free fire zone. The platoon's position was considered lost. The Sky Raiders' timely intervention at 14:15 was pivotal. Their strafing runs and napalm drops halted the North Vietnamese forces poised for another offensive. The devastating effects of the napalm, engulfing entire groups of the enemy, bolstered the beleaguered American spirits. For 2 relentless hours, the air support wreaked havoc on the enemy, allowing U.S. forces to regroup and fortify their position. By dusk, the scene had transformed. The wounded were evacuated, reinforcements bolstered defenses, and consistent artillery and aerial support ensured vigilance against any nocturnal enemy advances. McDade and his forces were poised and prepared for any oncoming assault. Galvanized his unit. Their sturdy defense deterred the North Vietnamese from persisting. Still, trapped by their lack of information and isolated from the main battalion, they could only stand their ground, awaiting rescue. As the shadows of conflict began to wane, reinforcement came forth. Bravo Company of the 1st Battalion of the 5th Cavalry, stationed at Landing Zone Columbus, was dispatched to join Forrest's forces in bolstering McDade's ranks. Navigating their way westwards, they clashed with the North Vietnamese but managed to establish a fortified perimeter by nightfall, thanks to the strategic leadership of Captains Tully and Forrest. By dawn, their path to Albany was clear. After the North Vietnamese soldiers withdrew from the scene, the gruesome aftermath of the battle unveiled itself. American soldiers began to retrieve their fallen comrades and assess enemy casualties. The heart-wrenching sight engraved in the minds of soldiers, who nicknamed the LZ Albany the Devil's Butcher Shop, a lingering testament to the war's brutality. In the subsequent days, a series of movements ensued, with McDade's shattered battalion eventually returning to Ankei base camp. And while Forrest's and Tully's companies faced one final skirmish at Columbus, it marked the end of the battle at Drang Valley. As the battle at LZ Albany dwindled, the ARVN-2 Corps Command took proactive steps to conclude the campaign, introducing the ARVN Airborne Brigade on November 17th. They established a new artillery base, LZ Crooks, which was fortified by the 2nd Battalion, 5th Cavalry. Intensive B-52 airstrikes continued for 2 subsequent days, targeting positions of the 66th, 33rd, and later the 32nd Regiments. The ARVN Airborne Brigade focused on the remaining battalions of the 320th Regiment, executing 2 strategic ambushes, one north and the other south of the IA Drang River. By November 26th, after no additional contact with the enemy, the ARVN pulled back, marking the end of intense combat in the area. The Ia Drang campaign, being one of the most significant battles during the Vietnam War, produced varied casualty figures from both sides. A 1966 PAVN report from the Central Highlands front claimed that during 5 major confrontations, their forces endured 559 deaths and 669 injuries. They estimated U.S. losses between 1,500 and 1,700 soldiers. Furthermore, the official PAVN history asserted the decimation of 1,700 U.S. and 1,270 ARVN soldiers, the downing of 59 helicopters, and the destruction of 89 vehicles during the campaign. In contrast, the U.S. military reported 305 fatalities and 524 injured, claiming 3,561 PAVN deaths and over 1,000 injured during skirmishes with the 1st Cavalry Division. The Battle of the Drang Valley remains one of the most fiercely fought battles of the Vietnam War. It was a battle of tactics, willpower, and determination, where both sides faced immense challenges and paid a heavy price. It exemplified the deadly efficiency of the North Vietnamese and their indomitable spirit, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Simultaneously, it showcased the tenacity, bravery, and adaptability of the American soldiers, who had to quickly learn and adapt to a new type of warfare in the dense jungles of Vietnam. The battles at the Drang Valley became a significant lesson for both sides. For the Americans, it was a reality check about the unconventional warfare they were to encounter, emphasizing the importance of good intelligence, coordination, and adaptability in the challenging terrains of Vietnam. On the other side, the North Vietnamese learned about the immense firepower of the American forces, from their artillery to their air capabilities, which they would need to consider in their future strategies. The varied casualty figures and claims from both sides highlight the propaganda war's intensity, with both trying to portray a version that highlighted their strengths and achievements. But numbers and claims aside, the battles in the Drang Valley serve as a somber reminder of the war's ferocity, the sacrifices made by the soldiers, and the lessons learned from such brutal confrontations. Today, the Drang battles hold a significant place in the annals of military history, with its lessons being studied in military academies worldwide. It also reminds us of the human cost of war and the importance of understanding the nuances of the environment and the adversary, rather than relying solely on firepower or numbers. Thank you for watching this episode. Please like and subscribe to the Militology channel if you want to see more content. Stay on the front lines with us by hitting the bell icon to be notified on our newest videos.